On the 14th of April 1935, a wall of dirt 2,000 feet high rolled across the Oklahoma panhandle and turned the middle of the afternoon into total darkness. People caught outside could not see their own hands. It was the worst of about 100 storms like it, and not one of them was weather. This video is about the money that made them. The drought was real and it was severe, but drought had come to those plains many times before without the ground getting up and leaving. What was different by 1935 was 20 years of prices, credit, and machinery, and that is what we are going to follow. The cheques, not the clouds. Start with the land itself, because the whole thing begins with a decision about who should own it and on what terms. The southern plains, running through western Kansas, the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles, and eastern Colorado and New Mexico are semi-arid. They get somewhere between 15 and 20 inches of rain in a good year and a great deal less in a bad one. And they had been covered, for as long as anybody could measure, in deep-rooted native grasses that held the soil down through droughts that lasted years. The federal government gave that land away. It gave it away deliberately, under a series of homestead acts, because a farm with a family on it was considered better public policy than an empty map, and because the land was worth nothing to the treasury while nobody was on it. The catch was that the standard homestead of 160 acres was a farm in Ohio and a joke in the panhandle. So Congress increased the parcel rather than reconsidering the plan. The Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909 offered 320 acres in the dry states, and the Stock-Raising Homestead Act of 1916 offered 640. Read that sequence carefully, because it is an admission. Every time the parcel got bigger, the government was conceding that the land was poorer than the last act had assumed, without ever concluding that it might be the wrong land to farm at all. And to make the offer respectable, there was a theory attached. It was called rain follows the plow, and it held that breaking the sod and planting crops would itself increase rainfall by putting moisture into the air and changing the local climate. It was promoted by railroad companies with land to sell, printed in settlement pamphlets, and repeated by men who genuinely believed it. It was nonsense. But it was nonsense that happened to coincide with two unusually wet decades on the plains, which meant that for years the evidence appeared to support it, and by the time the dry cycle returned, there were hundreds of thousands of people out there with mortgages. So here is the question this story turns on, and it is worth deciding your answer now rather than at the end. Every single farmer in this story did the rational thing with the land, the prices, and the credit in front of him. Nobody broke a law, and nobody was stupid. So when the soil went, whose fault was it? The drought, or the arithmetic that pointed every plow in the same direction at the same time? Go back to the terms of that offer, because the terms are what shaped the behavior. The original Homestead Act of 1862 gave a citizen 160 acres of public land for a small filing fee, on condition that he lived on it for 5 years and improved it. That is the whole transaction. The government took no money worth speaking of, and the settler took all of the risk, and both sides understood that a proportion of the takers would fail and walk away. That model built the middle of the United States, and on better land it worked. The plains version of it was the same instrument applied to ground that could not support it, and the response, as we have seen, was to make the parcels larger rather than to stop. Some of that land was opened in a hurry and in public. The Oklahoma land runs of 1889 and 1893 put tens of thousands of people on a starting line and let them ride for a claim, which is one of the most photographed events of the period and one of the least examined. Land distributed by a race goes to whoever is fastest, not to whoever can farm it, and the winners arrived owning acres and nothing else. What almost none of them had was capital. A homestead is free and a farm is not. You need a house, a well, a plow, animals, seed, and something to live on until the first harvest sells. Every one of those came from a country bank, against the land, and that is where the debt in this story begins, 30 years before the first dust storm. The thing that turned a slow settlement into an assault was the First World War. European farmland was under armies and European farm labor was in trenches, and the demand for American wheat went vertical. The federal government guaranteed a price of about $2 a bushel, which was roughly double what wheat had been paying, and it ran a campaign telling farmers that wheat would win the war. That is a remarkable position for a farmer to be in. A guaranteed price, unlimited demand, and a patriotic duty to produce as much as physically possible. Every acre of grass on the place is suddenly an acre of money not being made. So the grass came up. The period is known as the Great Plow-Up, and it is the largest and fastest conversion of grassland to cropland in American history. In the southern plains alone, something over 5 million acres of native sod were turned in the 5 years from 1925 to 1930, which was after the war had ended and the guaranteed price had gone. That last detail is the important one and most telling. Skip it. The plow-up did not stop when the wartime price stopped. It accelerated. Understanding why is the whole of this story. Part of the answer is that a good deal of the plowing was being done by people who did not live there. They were called Suitcase Farmers, and the name is exact. A man in Kansas City or Denver with some capital would buy or lease a section of panhandle grass, drive out in the spring with a tractor, break the sod, drill the wheat, and go home. He would come back at harvest, run a combine over it, sell the crop at the elevator, and leave again. There was no house on the place, no family, no well, and no livestock. There was no reason to think about next year's soil, because the operation was not a farm. It was a position taken on the price of wheat, using land as the instrument, and if the price stopped working, the position could simply be abandoned. That is a structural point rather than a moral one. A resident farmer with children on the place has some reason to protect the ground. A man who sees the land twice a year has none, and a great many of the acres that blew away had been opened by exactly that arrangement. And the farmer who did live there was, by the middle of the 20s, already in trouble. American agriculture did not enter its depression in 1929. It entered it in 1920, when the wartime demand ended and prices fell by more than half in a single year, while the debts taken on to expand stayed exactly where they were. Land values fell with the prices, which meant the security behind every one of those loans shrank at the same time. The whole of the 1920s, remembered elsewhere as a boom, was for the farm states a grinding decade of foreclosures and bank failures. Thousands of small country banks went under, most of them long before the stock market did, and each one took the local credit supply with it. So by the time the 1929 crash arrived, the plains had already had 9 years of it. What the crash did was remove the last of the demand, and what the drought did in 1932 was arrive on ground that was already stripped, already mortgaged, and already being worked by people with no margin of any kind. The reason is the machine, and the machine was bought on credit. Before about 1915, breaking sod on the plains meant horses and mules and a walking plow, and there is a natural limit to how much grass a family can turn with animals that have to be fed from the same farm. A man could not overextend himself very far, because his own muscles and his own animals were the constraint. The tractor removed the constraint. A tractor does not need to be fed when it is not working. It does not tire, and it will pull a disc plow through native sod all day. The combine harvester did the same thing at the other end of the season, letting one family cut and thresh a crop that would previously have needed a crew. Both of them cost money that a plains farmer did not have, so both of them were bought on time, against the farm. And a machine bought on credit changes the arithmetic of the whole operation permanently, because the payment is due whether the crop is good or not. That is the hinge of the entire Dust Bowl, and it has nothing to do with rain. Once your fixed costs are fixed, your only variable is volume. If wheat falls, the way to make the payment is to grow more wheat. If wheat falls again, you plow more grass. There is a name for this shape in every other industry, and it always ends the same way. Every individual producer responds to a falling price by producing more, because that is rational for each of them, and the aggregate result is that the price falls further, and the thing they are all producing from gets used up. Here the thing being used up was not a market. It was 3 feet of topsoil that had taken several thousand years to accumulate. Wheat did fall. It fell after the war as European production came back. It wobbled through the 20s and then it collapsed. By 1930, one wheat was selling for something in the region of 25 cents a bushel, which is roughly an eighth of the wartime guarantee. In 1930, one produced an enormous crop. The rain had been good, the acreage was vast because of everything above, and the plains delivered a record harvest into a market that had already stopped paying. It is worth understanding how little of that a farmer could see coming, because it explains why nobody stopped. A plains wheat farmer did not sell wheat to anybody he could look at. He hauled it to a country elevator. The elevator sold it into a railroad car. The railroad took it to a terminal market, and the price he received was set by trading in Chicago against a world crop that included Argentina, Canada, Australia, and by the late 20s, the Soviet Union. So the signal he received was a number on a board at the elevator, arriving with no explanation attached. It did not tell him whether the price was down because of a good harvest in Manitoba, or a bad one, or a trade policy, or because his own neighbors had produced too much. And a farmer cannot respond to a price the way a factory can. A factory can stop a shift. A field is committed in the autumn for a crop that sells the following summer, and by the time the price arrives, the decision was made 3 seasons ago, on a mortgage that assumed a better number. That is the position every single one of them was in, taking a long-dated, irreversible bet on a world price they had no visibility of, with fixed payments due either way. In that position, planting more acres is not greed. It is the only lever anybody has. Wheat was left standing in fields because cutting it cost more than it would fetch. Some was burned. Some was fed to livestock. Farmers who had done everything right, in the sense of working hard and producing a great deal, were ruined by the size of their own success. Then the rain stopped. The drought that began in 1932 was severe, and it lasted, in one form or another, for the better part of 8 years. But drought is normal on the southern plains. What was not normal was the condition of the ground when it arrived. Native prairie grass has roots that go down several feet, and it holds soil in place through years without rain. It is dormant, not dead, and when the rain returns it comes back. Millions of acres of it had been replaced by wheat, which is an annual with shallow roots, and which is bare ground for months at a time and dead ground entirely if the crop fails. There is a detail in the soil itself that explains why the storms went so far. Plains topsoil is not uniform. It is a mixture of coarse and very fine particles, and it is the finest fraction, the silt and clay, that carries the nutrients and holds the moisture. When wind moves loose soil, the heavy grains bounce along near the ground and the fine material goes up into the air column and travels. So a dust storm does not remove a layer evenly. It preferentially removes the most valuable part of the soil and leaves the sand behind, which means each storm made the ground both thinner and worse at the same time. By 1932, large parts of 5 states were, for most of the year, loose, dry dirt with nothing holding it. When the wind came across it, and the wind on the plains is constant, the dirt went with it. The storms were not like anything in living memory. There were 14 recorded in 1932 and 38 in 1933, and the counts kept climbing. They arrived as a rolling black wall that people compared to a mountain range moving sideways, and they carried so much static electricity that they shorted out car engines and knocked people down when they shook hands. The dust got into everything. Houses were sealed with tape and wet sheets over the windows, and the dust came in regardless, and it settled on food and in water and in beds. There was an illness people called dust pneumonia, from breathing fine silica for months on end, and it killed the very young and the very old first. Livestock died with their stomachs full of dirt. Fences disappeared under drifts the way they do under snow. Farms were abandoned and buried, and there are photographs of houses with dunes up to the eaves. The storm this video opened with is worth returning to properly, because the day it happened had begun beautifully. The morning of the 14th of April 1935 was clear, warm and still, after weeks of blowing dirt. People across the panhandle took it as a break in the weather. They went to church, they hung out washing, they opened windows and went visiting, and a great many of them were a long way from home in the middle of the afternoon. The first sign was birds. Flocks came through low and fast, going south, ahead of the thing behind them. Then the temperature fell sharply, and then the horizon to the north went black from the ground up. What arrived was a cold front driving a wall of soil that people put at 2,000 feet or more, moving at highway speed, and it took the daylight out completely. Drivers stopped where they were because headlights showed nothing at all. Families in the open sheltered in ditches and under wagons. Some walked into their own farmyards by feel and could not find the house. It lasted for hours in some places, and it is the reason that particular Sunday has a name of its own. The 14th of April 1935 is also the day the region got its name, and it got it from a reporter. Robert Jiger, working for the Associated Press, was traveling through the region and filed a dispatch about it, and in his copy, he described the stricken area as the Dust Bowl of the continent. The phrase went into a headline and then into the language, and within weeks, a set of counties nobody outside Kansas could have named had a national identity. That is worth noticing on a channel about money, because a region with a name gets appropriations and a region without one does not. There had already been one federal intervention, and it is the bleakest thing in the story. In 1934, with no grass and no feed and no water, cattle across the plains were starving on their feet and worth nothing at market because everybody was selling at once. So the government bought them. Under a drought relief program, it purchased something over 8 million head of cattle in 1934 at prices well above what the market was offering, which put cash into farm households at the moment they needed it most. A large proportion of the animals were in no condition to be used for anything and were destroyed on the spot. Set aside how that felt to the people who had raised them, and look at what the transaction was. The federal government bought a herd it did not want, at a price nobody else would pay, in order to move money to farmers without calling it relief. It is one of the more honest pieces of policy in the decade, and it is almost never mentioned. None of that produced a broader policy response for 3 years, and the reason is geography. It was happening a very long way from anybody who could do anything about it, to people with no money and no organization, in a country where a quarter of the workforce was already unemployed. What changed that was a storm that took the plains to Washington. In May 1934, A system picked up an estimated several 100 million tons of soil from the plains and carried it east. It darkened the sky over Chicago, where it dropped several pounds of dirt for every person in the city, and it went on to New York, Boston, and Washington, where the dust settled on the desks of the Capitol and dimmed the sun over the White House. Some of it fell on ships 200 miles out in the Atlantic. Hugh Hammond Bennett, a soil scientist who had spent his career arguing that American farming was destroying the ground it stood on, had been trying to get Congress to act for years and had a bill in front of a Senate committee. Bennett is the reason this became law, and the way he did it is famous. He had been tracking the weather and knew a plains dust event was moving east, and he stalled the hearing, at length, reading his testimony slowly, until the light in the committee room began to change. He then walked the senators to the window and showed them the dust from Texas and Oklahoma falling on Washington. The Soil Conservation Act passed in April 1935, and Bennett was made head of the new Soil Conservation Service. One thing before we go on: if you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a new piece of American financial history every single day. And leave a comment while you are here. It matters more than you would think. Now we come to the part of this story that is not in the photographs, and it is the part that actually moved the people. In 1933, Congress passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is one of the central pieces of the New Deal, and which was designed to solve the price problem rather than the soil problem. Its logic was simple and it was sound. Prices are catastrophically low because production is far too high, so the government will pay farmers to produce less. Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, ran it, and he was no outsider imposing a theory on farmers. He came from an Iowa farm family, edited a farm paper, and had spent years breeding hybrid seed corn. Under the act, a farmer who took land out of production received a payment. Acreage was reduced, supply came down, and prices did recover. As economics, it worked, and the argument for it is a good one. But read the instrument rather than the intention, and ask the question this channel always asks: who is the check made out to? The payment went to the person who controlled the land. On the plains and across the Cotton South, a very large proportion of the people actually farming did not control the land. They were tenants, share tenants and sharecroppers, working somebody else's acres for a share of the crop, and by the 1930s that was somewhere around 40% of all farmers in the country, and a great deal more than that in the South. The Act did contemplate this. There were provisions requiring landlords to share the payments with their tenants and to keep the same number of tenants on the place, and in many cases those provisions were honored. In many other cases they were not, and the mechanism by which they were not is the cleanest piece of financial engineering in this entire story. A landlord takes the government payment for reducing his acreage. He now has cash, and he has fewer acres in production, and therefore he needs fewer people. He uses the cash to buy a tractor, which lets him farm the remaining land with hired day labor instead of tenant families, and the tenants are told to go. There was a phrase for it at the time. People said they had been tractored out. The tenant was in the weakest possible position to argue. He owned no land, most often had no written lease, and in the South frequently owed the landlord money at the store. A federal program designed to raise farm incomes had put cash into the hands of exactly the party with the power to end the arrangement, and had given him a reason to. This is the point at which the two halves of the story fuse, and where almost every popular account gets it wrong. The Great Migration to California in the 1930s is remembered as the Dust Bowl Migration. Something like 2.5 million people left the Plains states during the decade, and around 200,000 of them went to California, and they were called Okies, whether or not they had come from Oklahoma. But the counties that were actually being buried in dust are not, for the most part, the counties that emptied into California. A substantial share of the people who made that journey came from eastern Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and Texas, from cotton country rather than from the wheat panhandle, and they were tenants and sharecroppers rather than owners. They were not, in the main, driven out by dust. They were driven out by a tractor bought with a federal check. That is not an argument against the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and it should not be read as one. Farm prices genuinely had to be brought up, and the alternative was a total collapse of American agriculture. It is an argument about instruments. A subsidy paid to the holder of an asset will be used to protect that asset, and if the people at risk are attached to the asset by nothing stronger than custom, the subsidy will end them. We have run into this shape before on this channel in other centuries and other countries, and it is always the same lesson. When a government writes a check in a crisis, the question that decides the outcome is not how large it is whose name is on it. What the migrants found in California is its own story and a short one. They arrived in a state with its own unemployment problem, in numbers, at speed, and with nothing. They were housed in ditch camps along the irrigation canals. They picked cotton and fruit for piece rates that fell as more of them arrived, and they were treated as a public order problem rather than as citizens moving within their own country. In February 1936, the Los Angeles Police Department did something genuinely extraordinary. James Davis, the chief of police, sent officers, well over 100 of them, to the state's borders, hundreds of miles outside his jurisdiction, to turn back people arriving without money. It was known as the Bum Blockade. It had no legal basis whatever. It was operated by one city's police force at the edges of a state it did not govern, and it ran for weeks before the legal objections and the ridicule shut it down. The federal response ran in the opposite direction. The Resettlement Administration, later the Farm Security Administration, built camps with sanitation and running water and elected camp councils, and it moved families out of the ditches. It also employed photographers, and this is where the Dust Bowl entered the national imagination. Dorothea Lange, a photographer working for the Resettlement Administration, produced the images that everybody now has in their head, including the one of a mother in a pea pickers camp in Nipomo taken in 1936. Think about what that program actually was. A federal agency paid photographers to travel the country, documenting the conditions that agency existed to relieve, and the photographs were released free to newspapers. The government bought the evidence for its own case, and the pictures are still the most effective argument for the New Deal that exists. They are honest photographs, and Lange was a serious artist. But it is worth knowing that the reason we can all see this decade so vividly, while other American catastrophes are invisible, is that somebody put a line for photography in a federal budget. Meanwhile, back on the plains, the actual soil work had begun, and it was substantial. The Soil Conservation Service sent men out to demonstrate contour plowing, terracing, strip cropping, and leaving stubble on the surface, instead of turning it under. Farmers were paid to adopt the practices, which is the only reason most of them did, since every one of the techniques costs money and yields nothing in the first year. There was a tree program. The Prairie States Forestry Project planted something in the order of 200 million trees in shelter belts running from the Dakotas down into Texas, on the theory that rows of trees across the wind would slow it near the ground. And the government bought land back. Under a land utilization program, it purchased millions of acres of the most marginal ground, moved the families off it, and returned it to grass. Much of it is public land to this day, managed as national grassland, and it is the same land the Homestead Acts had handed out 60 years earlier. That is a closed loop worth one sentence rather than 10. A government gave away land it should never have settled, and then paid cash to take it back. We have looked at that exact instrument in another country on a sister channel, so it is a step in this story rather than the point of it. The point of this story is what happened next, because the plains did not stay empty and the problem was not solved. The rains returned at the end of the 30s. Wheat prices went up with the Second World War, exactly as they had in the first one, and the acreage went straight back up with them. By the early 50s, there was another drought and another set of dust storms, smaller than the 30s but real. What stopped it the second time was not conservation. It was water, and the water came from underground. Beneath those plains lies the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the largest bodies of fresh groundwater on Earth, filled over thousands of years by a wetter climate that no longer exists. Cheap electricity, cheap diesel, and a new piece of machinery called the center pivot irrigator made it possible to lift that water and spray it across a circle of land half a mile across. From the 1950s onward, the southern plains were farmed on that water, and the results were spectacular. Land that could not reliably grow dryland wheat now grew irrigated corn. Cattle feedlots followed the grain. Counties that had been emptying filled up again. The aquifer is not being refilled. Recharge in that region is measured in fractions of an inch a year against extraction measured in feet. And in parts of Texas and Kansas, the water table has already dropped so far that pumping has stopped being economic, and the land has gone back to dryland farming or to grass. So look at the whole century, and the shape of it is unmistakable. The plains were settled on a theory that the plow would make rain. When that failed, the shortfall was covered by machinery bought on credit, and the credit was serviced by plowing more. When that failed, the shortfall was covered by federal payments, and the payments removed the people with the least security. And when that failed, the shortfall was covered by pumping water that took 10,000 years to arrive and will not be replaced. Every one of those was a rational response to the situation immediately in front of somebody. Every one of them worked for a while. And every one of them was paid for out of a stock of something that was not being replenished, whether that stock was soil or credit or water. Nobody in this story broke a law. The homesteaders took an offer their government made them in good faith. The farmers bought machinery on the terms their banks offered. The landlords took payments a federal act made available and spent them on equipment, which is what anybody would do. Congress passed a farm bill that raised prices, which is what it had been asked to do. So go back to where we started. When 3 feet of topsoil left 5 states and darkened the sky over Washington, the drought was the thing that carried it, and the drought was nobody's doing. But the reason there was loose dirt to carry was a chain of perfectly sensible decisions, made by people who were each solving the problem in front of them with the tools they had been given. The dust settled a long time ago. The arithmetic underneath it is still running, and it is now running on the water.